Chapter 3b, Notes, Syntax Structures. Objective 1a, to sketch the 5 syntax structures in Latin sentences. Objective 1b, to identify the parts of those structures. 1c, to divide up a disbalanced airplane. 2a, to tell where relative pronouns come from. 2b, to identify the two functions of a relative pronoun, or the two things it does in a sentence, and to correctly translate quem or quam. You might want to take notes, but do not need to. Much more important is completing the exercises correctly. Well, this information will be highly helpful to you in handling complex Latin sentences. Objective 1a, to sketch the 5 syntax structures in Latin sentences. Download this sheet from the link in the video description down below this video. Here are the diagrams for the 5 syntax structures that we're going to cover this year. They are in Latin and English sentences. First off, we have a genitive, which is like a tag, if you remember from previous videos. It tells whose. Then we have a prepositional phrase like through the window or in the house. Then we have a relative clause. And the relative clause is just the dip there. And that's a detour to say something more about some antecedent. Today we're going to handle heavily airplanes, which is any sentence with the word be, or a form of the verb to be. Is, are, sunt, have been, will be, all those. And then there are your regular sentences, which we call fastballs. Notice how a fastball has backspin. Well, this fastball has a verb that backspins its action onto its direct object. Hopefully you'll get familiar with these 5 structures in the video because you will be drawing them a lot. Objective 1b, to identify the parts of those syntax structures. As for simple syntax structures like tags and swords, or épées, like in fencing, there's no parts that need to be gotten into. Well, of the épée, there's the preposition itself, and then the noun, but that's not important. In relative clauses, there are 2 important parts. There is the relative pronoun who or which, or whom, who, whom, or which, or whose, or for whom, or in whom. And then there's the antecedent that it's talking about, which usually comes right before it. Well, let's go to fastballs. Fastballs are your standard sentences. They have a subject as their first part, usually in the nominative case. A direct object is their second part, usually in the accusative case. And then they have any transitive verb, I should say. A transitive verb is something that does something to something else, not a verb that just biologically acts in place, like grows or sighs. Okay. But airplanes have 2 parts. Airplanes also have a subject just like the fastballs, but an airplane, instead of having a direct object, has what's called a predicate nominative. Not a direct object, because it cannot have an accusative. Why? Because the characteristic of the verb to be is that in any language, you always say both words equally. If 2 things are the same thing, then they're equal. And so if the left one here is nominative, the right one is also going to have to be nominative. We have this in English. We say, I am he, using our English nominative form. We do not say, I am him, which would be like an accusative form. Or, you are she, not you are her. Of course, some people say her, but that's incorrect. So, the whole idea of this airplane is that existence implies equality. And so if you've got both sides must be nominative in the nominative case. So, well, if this second side over here on the right is nominative, then we can't call it a direct object. So they have a special name for it. It's not the nominative at the start in the subject. No, it's called a predicate nominative. Okay? So if I talk in class about what's the predicate nominative, that's what I'm referring to. It's the second thing in a sentence using the verb to be. Okay, so hopefully you know the parts of these various syntax structures. All right. To properly divide up a disbalanced airplane, objective 1C. All right, well, you learned just now what an airplane is. Hopefully you remember it's a sentence starting from the verb to be, or some form of to be. Is, are, were, have been, will be. Okay, so here we're going to have two things. A balanced airplanes will be on the left over here. All these will be balanced, and they're balanced because the verb to be is in the middle. And then sometimes you have in Latin, not usually in English, but definitely in Latin, a disbalanced airplane. Exactly the same as a balanced airplane on the left, but the verb is at the end of the sentence on the far right. So that's disbalanced. Everything else is the same. Marcus, Marcus. Frater meus, frater meus. Est, est. The only difference is the verb is there on the right. Okay, but this can be a little confusing because we can have a long string of words like Dominus servorum maritus familiae, and it can be overwhelming. So you need to get good at dividing up the two wings of the disbalanced airplane. When it's balanced, it's easy to see the wings. There's one wing on the left of the verb and one wing on the right. But when it's disbalanced, both wings are on the left and they're hard to see. So we need to work on knowing where does the first wing end and the next wing begin. So here's the rule. Everything anchors off the nouns. I symbolize nouns in this exercise by a rectangular box. So nouns or noun phrases. Now what's a noun phrase? Well, a noun phrase is a noun, like this box here, attached to something else, like another noun. David Rudman is a noun phrase. Or attached to a genitive, the husband of the girl. Or attached to an adjective, the blue boy. Or attached to a prepositional phrase, the boy in the house. So if you have multiple words stuck together to a noun, that's called a noun phrase. So nouns or noun phrases have priority in taking the two wings. But if there is only one noun or only one noun phrase, not two, then the remaining wing may be taken up by something else, anything else, such as an adjective. Here we symbolize adjectives with these dashed circles, or with a prepositional phrase. Of course, the ideal is that you would have two nouns, one for each wing. But sometimes that second wing has to take one of these two over here. Okay, so let's look at our possible situations. First is the ideal. You can have noun, and here on the right we happen to have a noun phrase, my brother. And then in its disbalanced form, you have noun and noun phrase. Next, we can have Marcus is happy. Are there two nouns in that? No, I don't think so. Happy's not a noun. It's not a person, place, or thing. Happy's an adjective. So we didn't have two nouns here. So the adjective takes over for it here in the second wing. Incidentally, in Latin, you can always translate a standalone adjective as if it were a noun by putting the word person or thing or one on the end of it. So instead of Marcus is happy, you could have said Marcus is a happy person or is a happy one. And in its disbalanced form, Marcus happy is, or Marcus a happy one is. Okay, and then here's another possibility. Marcus is in Great Rome. Now, you might say, oh, Mr. Rudman, you have a noun there, a second noun, so that should be the wing, right? Well, it would be, but it's stuck inside this bigger prepositional phrase. And so it's not a standalone noun. It really had to be a standalone noun to take up a wing. But this noun is buried inside. So Marcus is your first wing. In great Rome is the second wing. There is no other noun, really. And then over here, Marcus in great Rome is. Or you might say, in great Rome, Marcus is. Or if the verb came first, there is a Marcus in great Rome. Or there is in great Rome a Marcus. So hopefully you've got familiar with all these possibilities. Ideally, you want a noun anchoring each wing. And so if you find that second noun especially, then you know usually that the second wing is starting there. Like, here's that second noun. If I was reading the sentence, I'd say to myself, okay, Marcus, and then I'd get to a second noun, frater, and that's my signal that a new wing is starting, and that this is going to be the predicate nominative now, not the subject. So watch out for that second noun. Let's go down and try some exercises. Divide up these unbalanced airplanes. In other words, split up the two wings. Where does the first wing end and where does the second wing begin? And I have 4 suggestions to help you. Most of this stuff you could have probably figured out on your own, so ignore this if it's a problem, but these are suggestions that might help you. Number 1, start from the verb. If the verb's number, whether it's singular or plural, matters. So if it's a plural verb, then you better have a plural noun, like Joe and John, or men. If it's a singular verb, then you better have a singular noun, like just Joe, or man. Suggestion B, count your nouns, and select up to 2 of them to anchor each wing. Suggestion C, attach anything remaining to those 2 nouns. And suggestion D, use common sense. Hopefully you know what these words mean, and that should help you to interpret the sentence. You probably can just use your sense, your intuition, to figure out these. All right, example. Amelia uxor Julii est. Well, I was reading it, I saw Amelia uxor. There's my second noun, so that was a signal to me that that's the new wing. And so you can see I wrote in red here a line underneath of it. So here I've shown the 2 wings, and this exercise is complete. If you wanted to do more, you could mark it all up like that. That tells you, oh, we've got a noun, then a genitive name tag. But you didn't have to draw that much. The only thing you really had to draw was the 2 wings underneath. All right. Why don't you try these 6 exercises below, stop the video, and then I will put up and go over the answers in a second. On the first one, watch out. This is some guy's 3 names. He has 3 names in his name. Okay, and the answers. All right, number 1, Lucius Ahenobarbus Crispus is the father of Quintus. Number 2, pater materque, mother and father, in the river are. So in the river was your second wing. Number 3, my sister Julia, a good girl is. Now this would have been a little deceiving. You might have thought bona goes with the first wing. You could have done it that way. My good sister Julia is a girl. You could have said that. But here you have to use your common sense. And it makes more sense to say that someone's good than to just say that they're a girl. Okay. Number 4, the master of the slaves is the husband of Amelia. 5, here's a question, and notice that in questions the verb often comes first. Are those 2 men happy? Notice I had only 1 noun. I could have divided it up differently. I could have said, are those 2 ones happy men? But it makes a little more sense to do it the way we did. And lastly, number 6. Here too we have only 1 noun, so there are several ways we could divide it up, but some make more sense than others. In Africa, rivers few there are. So we could have made 1 wing in Africa. In Africa there are few rivers. Or we could have considered in Africa as a separate thought and said, in Africa, the rivers are few. And therefore, in Africa was set off by this comma here that kind of kept it separate from the main clause. 2a, to tell where relative pronouns come from. All right, in your charts, we have several new relative pronouns to uncover this stage. And you notice they all start with what two letters? That's right, QU. Well, where did they come from? They actually came from que plus these personal pronouns over here, he, she, it, him, her, it. So if you remember from your vocab what que means, it means and, doesn't it? That's your ampersand, like mom and dad, boys and girls. So que really means and he. Now why is this important? Well, anytime you have one of these relative pronouns, we're going to tell you that you can translate it as who, whom, or which. But if you're having trouble, then you can always go back to its ancient meaning and just stop the first sentence and say and he. Or if it's got a feminine ending on it, and she. Or and it. Or and him. Or and her, or and it, or and they. So all of these are reducible back to que plus some pronoun, he, she, it, they. So what do these mean though? The simplest answer that will work for all of these are which in English. Which will work for any of them. But for the masculines and feminines, often it makes more sense to say who. However, you can actually only say who for the nominatives. See, who or which. You cannot say who for any of the other cases. Why? Because all the rest of these use whom with an M on the end. So especially when Latin has an M on the end of it, you'd better translate it as whom, but also in these other cases, which we aren't going to get to in this stage. We often do this wrongly in English. We often say, who you gonna call? Ghostbusters. But what should we say? Whom you gonna call? Because it's accusative. It's not the doer, but the done to of the sentence. It's the object. It's not the subject. You're doing the calling. You're the subject. But who's the object? You're calling them. So you should say, whom are you gonna call? Ghostbusters. But people always say this wrong in English. So anytime in Latin you see an M on the end, I want you to translate it whom or which, not who or which. All right. And to or for whom in the dative, well, we haven't learned dative, and under, in, down from whom in the ablative. Genitive is a little bit different. There's also a special translation for genitive whose, but you can also say of whom. So, which, who, whom, who. That's how you translate these. And the other translation that will work for all of them is and blank. So, I see a girl who is happy could be, I see a girl and she is happy. Just change the who to and she. You could translate it like that. So, we learned where relative pronouns come from, and now we have to identify the two functions of a relative pronoun. The two functions of a relative pronoun are discernible from a standard relative clause. We could make it an accusative relative pronoun and say, the girl whom I know is my sister. So, what are the two things that this relative pronoun whom does? Well, the first thing that it does is it refers back up to its antecedent, which is the word right before it. In this case, the girl. It tells more about her. It talks about her. So when you ask whom is the word whom talking about, it's talking about the girl, because it's referring to her. So that's one of the things that a relative pronoun does.
it points back or links back to the word right before it, almost like an adjective.
But the other thing it does is it functions inside of its own little relative clause. By the way, in case you didn't know, a clause is like a mini sentence. It has a verb in it, and it could stand by itself if the rest of the sentence weren't there. So in this sentence, we have two clauses. We have the main clause, the girl is my sister, and then we have the relative clause, and I know her. Because remember, we can translate whom as and her. So we could have said, the girl is my sister, and I know her. That would be an acceptable way to translate that sentence. Okay, so the two things whom can do is it refers to its antecedent, the girl, and it functions normally within its own relative clause. Well, what is it functioning as? Well, here it's doing the job of direct object. It's receiving the action of
Knowing.
So I know her. If it were who, then it would be the subject. If it were whose, then it would be a possessor. The girl whose daughter I know. If it were for whom, then it would be
An indirect object.
So in all these ways, it's just doing any of the normal things that you know words do in a sentence. So it does any of those normal things as one of its jobs, and the other thing it does is refers back up to its antecedent. If you would like more practice sketching syntax structures,
then I have a huge number of practice exercises here. And so I'll introduce them all and then put all the answers up at the end. So just keep listening here until I say that I'm about to put up the answers. And then you can stop the video then and attempt however many of them you want to attempt. Okay, so here's the first group.
I did number 1 for you, and you would use any one of these 5 syntax structures up here. So if you see a genitive, it's a tag. If you see a prepositional phrase, it's a sword. If you see a who, whom, qui, quai, it's a relative clause. If you see the verb be, it's an airplane, and if you see a normal verb, then it's a fastball. So you might want to practice doing that. Notice, of course, that sometimes some of these bigger syntax elements can contain things inside of them. So there might be a name tag inside of a relative clause. So why don't you try that if you would like some more practice. Number 1 through 12, number 1 through 6. Here you're doing multiple syntax structures, and when I lower something, that's a relative clause. And then on the next page, it says if you want more practice on labeling the parts of a syntax structure. So I've labeled the parts underneath of it. The first wing is the subject, the second wing is the predicate nominative. So if you wanted to go back and label all those now, you can do that. And you can do that again right here. All right. Exercise 4. This is for if you would like practice identifying or marking up relative clauses and marking up the two things that a relative pronoun does. So first, we see that it refers to its antecedent, that's that arrow. And second, we see that it plays a function in the sentence. So here it's in a prepositional phrase whose function is place to which. Other functions, of course, are subject, direct object, predicate nominative, possession of the whole, place to which. So that's if you would like more practice with that. You can attempt number 2 through 6. And now let's go to the answers. Here's the answers for part 1 and part 3, because I have all the functions put in green underneath. Here's the answers for part 2 and 3. Notice in something like 6 here, we've got a fastball with a relative clause inside of it, and then a prepositional phrase inside of that. Isn't that fun? And then as far as marking the 2 jobs of every relative pronoun, here are the answers to those. So hopefully you've got a lot of practice of this. Let's go back to our objectives and see if we accomplish them. To sketch the 5 syntax structures in Latin sentences, they are the name tag, the sword, the relative clause, the airplane, and the fastball. Objective 2b, to identify the parts of those syntax structures.
The relative clauses parts are a relative clause introduced by a relative pronoun. The airplanes parts are a subject and a predicate nominative. And the fastballs parts are a subject and a direct object.
Objective 1C, to properly divide up a disbalanced airplane, look for the second noun as a signal of the start of the second wing. To tell where relative pronouns come from, well, they come from quem plus a personal pronoun. To identify the two functions of a relative pronoun, well, it refers to its antecedent, and it functions normally within its own relative clause. Its case determines how it functions inside of there. And then to translate quem quam as preferably whom, but if not that which, but if not that and him or and her, and never translate it as who. So hopefully you were able to do the exercises and are all prepared now to chop up any Latin sentence that you see and know what its syntax is. By the way, syntax is a Greek word that means order. So now you know how to order the elements of a sentence.